The night Margaret Holloway found the cat, it was raining hard enough to blur the streetlights into pale orange smears against the dark. She had been driving home from her shift at the hospital when she spotted the animal crouched beneath a dumpster near the edge of the parking lot, a small, drenched shape trembling in a shallow pool of rainwater. She almost kept driving. Almost. But something in the way the cat held itself, rigid and silent, not like an animal sheltering from rain, but like one that had already accepted whatever came next, made Margaret pull over and cut the engine. She wrapped the cat in the emergency blanket she kept folded in her back seat. The animal did not fight her. It was only when she settled it into her lap beneath the steering wheel and felt the hard, distended weight of the cat's belly that Margaret understood. This wasn't just a stray. This cat was pregnant, heavily so, and the faint tremors running through its body were not from cold alone. She drove straight to the 24-hour veterinary clinic on Glenfield Road. Dr. Raymond Holt had been awake since 5 that morning. He was finishing a patient file when Margaret carried the cat through the glass front door, dripping water across the tile floor. He took one look at the animal and waved the front desk assistant aside. Within minutes, the cat was on the examination table under bright lights, and Dr. Holt was already running his hands along its abdomen with the careful attention of someone reading a message written in Braille. "How far along do you think she is?" Margaret asked from behind him. He did not answer immediately. He pressed 2 fingers just below the cat's ribcage, then lower. Then he reached for a portable ultrasound wand without saying a word. The contractions had already begun. Margaret later described the following 3 hours as the strangest of her life, and she had spent 12 years working in an emergency ward, which made that statement mean something. The first kitten arrived just after 11 at night. Dr. Holt caught it in a clean towel and held it up to the light. He stopped. Not dramatically, not with any sound. He simply went still, the way a person goes still when they see something their brain hasn't finished classifying yet. He turned the newborn gently in his hands, examining its ears, the shape of its head, the unusual density of the thin coat already visible along its spine. Then he set it beside the mother and picked up his pen. "Keep watching," he said quietly, more to himself than to Margaret. "We're not done yet." They were not done. Not by a long way. Over the next 2 hours, 9 more kittens were born, and with each one that arrived, the expression on Dr. Holt's face shifted slightly further from routine into something Margaret could only describe as careful, controlled surprise. By the time the 10th kitten had been cleaned and placed against the mother's side, the room had gone very quiet. 10 kittens, alive, breathing, but not quite the same. Margaret stood at the edge of the examination table and looked at the row of tiny, damp bodies pressing against the mother cat's belly. She counted them twice. 10 was already an exceptional number for a domestic cat, far above the average litter size of 4 to 6. But it wasn't the number that made her chest feel strange. It was the way they looked. Some of them appeared as she would have expected, small, pink-nosed, with the soft, folded-ear look of any newborn kitten. But others were different, in ways that were difficult to name and harder to dismiss. 2 of them had ears that seemed proportionally longer than the rest, lying flat and wide against their skulls in a way that suggested they would be significant once they opened up. One kitten, positioned at the far end of the group, was noticeably larger than its siblings, not just heavier, but structurally broader, with thicker limbs and a head that looked more substantial in proportion to its body. Another had a coat that was darker and denser even in those first hours, the fur almost coarse to the touch. Dr. Holt moved from one kitten to the next, lifting each one briefly, checking reflexes, examining paw pads, running a fingertip along the ridge of each spine. He made notes without sharing them. When he reached the larger kitten near the end, he paused again, then lifted it and held it beside one of the smaller ones, so the difference was visible to both of them at once. "They're not all the same," Margaret said. "No," Dr. Holt agreed. "They are not." He set the kittens back, watched the mother for a moment, and then turned to face Margaret fully for the first time since the births had begun. "Their development patterns are inconsistent," he said. "Some of what I'm seeing could be natural variation within a litter. Some of it could be something else entirely. I'd like to run a few tests before we draw any conclusions." He paused. "What I can tell you right now is that this litter is not genetically uniform, and the reasons for that are going to be interesting. Margaret had not yet gone home. It was past 1 in the morning, and she was leaning against the wall of the recovery room, watching the mother cat through the glass panel of the kennel door. The cat, whom Margaret had begun privately calling Wren, after the small brown bird was doing what mothers do. She was washing each kitten in turn with methodical, unhurried strokes of her tongue, working from head to tail, repositioning each one as she finished. But Margaret had been watching long enough to notice something else. Wren kept certain kittens closer to her body. The smaller ones, the ones that looked most like ordinary domestic cats, were pressed against her belly in a compact cluster, rarely moving far before the mother's paw drew them back. The larger kitten, the broad-limbed one with the unusual coat, was fed when it pushed forward, but it was not pulled close in the same way. Neither were the two with the long, flat ears. They nursed. They were not excluded, but there was a distance, barely measurable, between how Wren held them and how she held the others. Margaret noticed it because she had spent years noticing things about patients who couldn't speak for themselves. The slight hesitation before Wren repositioned a particular kitten, the way her tail curled more tightly around some than others. The small, repeated moments in which she appeared to make a choice, however instinctive, about who was centered and who was left at the margins. It troubled Margaret in a way she found difficult to articulate. She pressed her palm flat against the kennel glass and watched Wren's amber eyes half close in the way of cats that are exhausted but not fully at rest. "Why?" Margaret said softly. Wren did not answer. She pulled one of the smaller kittens closer and resumed washing. The question stayed with Margaret through the drive home and into the gray light of early morning. Dr. Holt called her 2 days later. He had, he said, consulted with a colleague at the University Veterinary Genetics Department. He wanted to discuss the possibility of DNA testing the litter. Margaret sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. "DNA testing," she repeated. "For kittens." "For the entire litter," Dr. Holt said. "What I'm observing in their physical development, combined with the inconsistency in phenotypic traits, suggests something I've only encountered twice in my career." "Are you familiar with the term superfecundation?" Margaret was not. He explained it carefully. In species that go through multiple cycles of ovulation, or in cases where ovulation is induced by mating, it is biologically possible for a single litter to contain offspring from more than one male parent. The mother's eggs, released across a period of days, can be fertilized by different males during the same reproductive window. The result is a litter, that is, genetically speaking, a collection of half-siblings sharing a mother but not a father. In domestic cats, Dr. Holt explained, this happened more often than most people assumed, particularly in free-roaming females with access to multiple mates. What made Wren's litter unusual was not the phenomenon itself, but the degree of physical variation on display. The differences between some of these kittens went beyond what he would expect from ordinary domestic variation. "There are physical markers," he said, "that suggest one or more of the fathers may not have been a domestic cat." The silence on Margaret's end of the line lasted long enough that Dr. Holt asked if she was still there. "I'm here," she said. "I just need you to say that again." He said it again. She agreed to the testing. For the first few weeks after the births, Margaret chose a simpler explanation. She told herself that what Dr. Holt was seeing was variation, the ordinary, beautiful unpredictability of genetics, expressing itself across a large litter. She had done enough biology to know that traits skipped generations, recombined unexpectedly, produced outliers that looked nothing like their parents. She had read about melanistic domestic cats with unusually dense fur. She knew some breeds carried genes that resulted in elongated features. None of what she was seeing, she told herself, required a dramatic conclusion. Some of her neighbors did not share her composure. A woman 2 doors down who occasionally helped Margaret with feeding duties took one look at the larger kitten and stepped back from the kennel. "That's not a normal cat," the woman said. "You should talk to someone about what to do with it." Margaret felt a coldness move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. She thanked her neighbor, closed the kennel, and did not ask for her help again. Others were gentler but no less concerned. A friend suggested that if any of the kittens carried unusual genetics, it might be kinder to the animals and safer for any future homes to have the litter assessed by a wildlife specialist before anyone became attached. Another person mentioned that exotic hybrid animals, even well-meaning ones, had complex needs that could become unmanageable over time. Margaret listened to all of it. She did not dismiss any of it, but she noticed that the people most willing to recommend separation had spent the least time looking at the kittens themselves, at the 10 small bodies that still pressed together at night, that still turned toward the warmth of the mother, even as they grew strong enough to move independently. And then, one afternoon, one of the kittens made a sound. It was the larger one, the broad-limbed kitten Margaret had begun calling Reed. He was 3 weeks old, wedged into the corner of the kennel, with both front paws braced against the metal mesh, apparently testing his grip. Margaret was across the room when she heard him vocalize. She turned. What she heard was not a meow. It was not quite a chirp. It was a short, percussive trill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in his chest than an ordinary kitten's call, a sound with texture to it, with the faint quality of something that belonged outdoors. Margaret stood very still. Then she went to get her phone and called Dr. Holt. By the 6th week, the behavioral differences within the litter had become impossible to attribute to coincidence or individual personality. Reed had discovered that he could scale the inside of the kennel enclosure with a facility that seemed to genuinely surprise him each time, as though the grip of his wide paws against the wire mesh was new information his body kept, offering him. He spent long periods near the top of the structure, not distressed, not seeking a way out, simply elevated and watchful. From above, he looked down at the room with a stillness that was not typical of young domestic kittens who tend to be volatile and easily distracted. Reed watched. He catalogued. He waited. 2 of the long-eared kittens, both female, both slightly lighter boned than their siblings, had begun digging. Not scratching in the perfunctory way of cats working loose litter, but excavating, with both front paws working in deep, rhythmic alternation, as though following an instruction no one had given them. Margaret found small craters in the corners of the lined kennel box each morning. A third kitten, one of the middle-sized ones, with a distinctive pale stripe along his forehead, had developed a habit of sitting several inches apart from the rest of the group, not asleep, not engaged with toys or food, simply observing the activity around him with a quality of attention that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Margaret named him Colt, and Colt spent hours in that position watching, processing, present in some way that was harder to dismiss as ordinary feline behavior the older he got. The contrast with the 4 kittens, who showed no unusual traits, was striking precisely because the domestic kittens were so recognizably, comfortingly normal. They played with noise and abandon. They fell asleep mid-action. They batted at moving fingers and lost interest immediately. They were entirely uncomplicated cats. And then there was everything else. Margaret drove to the clinic on a Thursday morning to hear what the genetics laboratory had found. Dr. Holt had the results on his desk. He had reviewed them twice before she arrived, and he had prepared a careful way of presenting the information, a way that led with science before it led with implication. He understood that what he was about to say would be easier to hear if it came first, as a series of facts. He spread 3 printed pages across the desk between them. The results confirmed what he had suspected. The litter of 10 kittens shared a single maternal genetic profile. Wren was unambiguously the mother of all 10. But the paternal genetics told a different story. At least 3 distinct paternal lines were present across the litter. The 4 kittens, who had developed along normal domestic lines, shared one paternal profile, a genetic signature, consistent with a male domestic cat, likely a free-roaming tom in the area. 3 of the other kittens shared a second profile, one that Dr. Holt's colleague had flagged as unusual. It showed markers consistent with a wild felid lineage, possibly a bobcat, given the geographic region, though the sequencing could not be precise without additional comparison samples. The remaining 3 kittens, including Reed and the 2 long-eared diggers, carried a third paternal profile that had required the most analysis. The university team's preliminary assessment described it as showing characteristics associated with the lynx genus, a finding they had noted as extraordinarily rare in an accidental litter context. Superfecundation, Dr. Holt explained, was the mechanism. Wren had been a free-roaming female in an area that apparently overlapped with the territories of multiple males, including at least one, possibly two, wild felids. During her fertile period, she had mated with more than one male, and multiple eggs had been fertilized at different intervals. The result was a single litter that was simultaneously, technically, 3 separate genetic families. Margaret looked at the pages for a long time. "They're all hers," she said finally. "Every one of them," Dr. Holt confirmed. She looked up at him. "Then what happens now?" He did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was, "It depends on what you decide." After the results, Margaret went home and sat for a long time in the room where she had set up the kitten's kennel. The facts had rearranged certain things in her understanding, but they had not changed what was in front of her. 10 animals, breathing. A mother who had survived a cold, wet parking lot and 3 hours of labor. Kittens who still pressed together at night, still nursed, still made the sounds that small animals make when they are figuring out the world. What the genetics explained, Margaret realized, was the behavior she had noticed from the beginning. Wren's selective closeness, the way she held the ordinary kittens tighter, the way she kept the others at a slight remove was not cruelty. It was not indifference. It was something older and harder than either of those things. A survival instinct, inherited across millions of years of evolution, that recognized, on some level below thought or choice, that the kittens who carried wild lineage genetics would require more, would be harder, would not necessarily survive the same way the others would. What the genetics could not explain was what Margaret saw on the 4th night after she brought the results home. She had gotten up at 2 in the morning for a glass of water, and had passed the kennel room without intending to check on it. But a sound stopped her in the hallway, the low, continuous rumble of a cat nursing a large group, the kind of sound that filled a room gently, like water filling a vessel. She looked through the gap in the door. Wren was curled in the center of the kennel, not in the position she typically held during daytime feeding, but lower, fuller, more encompassing. And pressed against her, in a configuration that was different from what Margaret had observed during the day, were all 10 kittens. Reed was there, tucked against Wren's back. The long-eared pair were there, folded into the curve behind her front legs. Every one of the 10, the ordinary ones, the unusual ones, the ones that carried traits no domestic living room was built for, was touching her. Wren was awake. Her eyes caught the light from the hallway in 2 small amber points. She looked at Margaret without alarm. She was, in that moment, feeding all of them. Margaret leaned against the doorframe and did not move for a long time. What changed in Margaret after that night was not dramatic or sudden. It was the kind of change that happens in the deep structures of a person's understanding, the kind that shows up later in decisions rather than in speeches. She had come into the situation afraid that something was wrong, afraid that the kittens were defective, afraid of what it would mean to be responsible for animals that did not fit the categories she knew. She had wanted to find a correction, a fix, a way to classify the problem and assign it to someone better equipped. She no longer wanted that. What she wanted was more specific and more difficult. She wanted to understand what each of these 10 animals needed, and she wanted to provide it. She began by going back to Dr. Holt with the genetics results and asking a different set of questions, not what is wrong with them, but what do they require. He connected her with a wildlife rehabilitation specialist named Dr. Anita Calloway, who operated a sanctuary 2 counties north, and who had experience with hybrid felids and with the particular challenges of animals that existed between categories too wild for ordinary domestic life, too habituated to humans for a standard release. Dr. Calloway was practical and direct. She told Margaret what she was likely looking at in terms of the animals with the strongest wild lineage markers, and she told her honestly that 2 of the 10 Reed and 1 of the long-eared females, the larger of the pair, would need more space and more specialized care than any private home, however well-meaning, could reasonably provide as they reached maturity. She said this without judgment, and she offered to accept them at the sanctuary when the time came. Margaret agreed. It was the hardest agreement she had made in a long time, and she made it because she had stopped thinking about what she wanted and started thinking about what they needed. For the remaining 8, she put together a plan. The 4 fully domestic kittens were placed with vetted homes through a rescue organization she trusted, homes she had personally visited, where she had met the people and judged, correctly as it turned out, that they were the kind of people who understood what a commitment was. 3 of the middle-range kittens, including Colt with his watchful, pale-striped face, remained with Margaret in a household she gradually reconfigured to accommodate their particular habits. More vertical space, more outdoor access in a secured enclosure, a quieter routine. She learned what each of them responded to and what made them retreat, and she adjusted accordingly. Wren lived with Margaret. This had never been a question. Throughout the months of placement and adjustment, Wren remained the constant. She did not seem disturbed by the gradual reduction of the litter, or if she was, she expressed it in the quiet way of cats, in a brief, concentrated investigation of each empty space, before settling into a new position that made sense of the space she occupied now. She was a small cat for the enormity of what she had produced. She had the nondescript coloring of a cat that had spent its life being overlooked, brown-gray, with a faint tabby pattern that was almost invisible in low light. She ate steadily and slept in the square of sun that moved across the kitchen floor each morning. What Margaret noticed, in the months, and then the year that followed, was that Wren always seemed to know when the sanctuary animals had been active. The morning after Dr. Calloway sent a video of Reed navigating the sanctuary's outdoor enclosure, leaping easily from a low platform to a high shelf in a single fluid arc. Vocalizing in that chest-deep trill, Wren sat by the window for a long time and made a sound Margaret had not heard from her before, low and continuous, directed at the glass. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her. She thought about the night in the kennel, all 10 kittens against one small mother, the ordinary ones and the extraordinary ones, and the ones who had no clean category, all of them in the same circle. What had survived was not what biology had predicted. The wild lineage kittens were not expected to thrive in a domestic context, and they had not fully, not in the ways that the ordinary cats had. But they had lived. They had grown. They had found the spaces where their particular bodies and temperaments made sense, and in those spaces they had become something coherent. Reed at the sanctuary leaped between platforms with the confidence of an animal that had found the correct grammar for its own body. The long-eared female, whom Dr. Calloway named Iris, had claimed a section of the sanctuary's brush enclosure as territory and defended it with a quiet, absolute authority that the staff described as striking even among the animals they regularly worked with. They were not what Margaret had expected to care for when she stopped her car beside a dumpster on a rainy night. They were not what anyone in her life had advised her to keep. They were strange and demanding and, in the case of the ones she had placed out of her home, ultimately beyond her capacity to give what they required. She had failed them in some of the ways she had hoped not to, and succeeded in ways she had not known to hope for. A year and a half after that night in the parking lot, Margaret drove north to visit Dr. Calloway's sanctuary with Colt riding in a carrier on the back seat, a well-adjusted, watchful cat who had learned to tolerate car travel if he could see Margaret's profile from where he sat. She walked through the outdoor enclosures in the early morning light. She saw Iris first, a long, rangy shape, half hidden in the brush, tracking her approach with eyes that were amber and unreadable, and entirely calm. Then she saw Reed on the elevated platform structure, larger now, substantial and unhurried, lying with his head resting on the edge of the platform as though the world below him was a book he was reading for the second time. Margaret stopped at the edge of the enclosure fence. Reed lifted his head and looked at her. He did not come to her. He did not need to. He looked at her with the same kind of awareness he had shown as a 6-week-old kitten in a kennel room, the watchful, cataloging stillness of an animal that was exactly what it was, without apology. She thought about what Wren had done that night, not the biology of it, not the superfecundation, not the gene markers, not the complex science of a litter that was, technically, 3 families compressed into one act of survival. She thought about the circle, the amber eyes in the dark, the decision, made below language and outside choice, to feed all of them. Family, Margaret had come to understand, was not about sameness. It was not about shared genetics, or shared space, or even shared memory, though all of those things could be part of it. It was about return, about the pull, in a moment of stillness, toward the ones who had mattered. About the fact that a small gray-brown cat who had spent her arbor life overlooked had produced something extraordinary without meaning to, and had then done, in the dark of an early morning, the only thing she knew how to do, gather it close. Wren was asleep on the kitchen floor when Margaret got home that evening. She was curled in the warm square left by the afternoon sun, which had moved on but left the floor tiles heated through. Colt was beside her, not touching her, but near enough that the distinction felt like a formality. Margaret set her keys on the counter and stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and looked at the two of them, a small, unremarkable cat who had come in from the rain, and a strange, watchful animal who had never been quite what anyone expected, lying in the same warmth, in the same room, on the same quiet evening. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. She put the kettle on, and the animals slept, and outside the window, the light moved the way light does when a day is ending slowly, without resistance, until the dark comes, and everything that belongs together finds its way back into the same circle.